Hey guys, picture this. A ragtag group of wild-eyed horsemen appearing out of the dust like an uninvited storm, their laughter rolling across the plains louder than thunder. What if I told you that these weren't fictional desperados, but the most feared cavalry in North America, holding back an empire's expansion with nothing but their own grit and a few dozen thousand ponies? Stick around for the next minute and I promise you'll never look at cowboy hats the same way again. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. You wake up with a headache from last night's campfire whiskey and the blaring sun of the southern plains already grilling your scalp. There's no morning coffee, just the distant whinny of a horse and the clang of a steel pot someone left on the embers. Only then do you remember. You're not alone here. You're deep in Comanche, the realm of the Comanche, a people so ferocious that even their horses seem to grin at you with wicked amusement. Welcome to their world, where survival isn't a right, it's an offense. Imagine the settlers' diaries. Day after day, they describe being ambushed by naked savages who rode into camp spears glinting, then vanished like ghosts into the tall grass. They called it miracle mobility, but let's call it what it really was, a cavalry trick that made the US Army look like a bunch of bumbling rookies. These guys could eat buffalo heart raw, wash it down with swigs of distilled hide juice, and be back on the warpath before most of us could brew a cup of tea. Here's the absurd bit. The Comanche didn't even start on horses. They were the original wild card, the original Uber drivers of the plains, grabbing Mustangs from the Spanish, training them until they were faster than bullets, and then dressing their infantry in buckskin so tight it might as well have been a haute uniform. By the early 1700s, they'd perfected guerrilla warfare a century before anyone in Europe had heard the word. You, dear viewer, would struggle to keep up. You'd set your watch, aim your rifle, think you hear hoofbeats, and then, poof, you'd be surrounded by a cloud of dust shaped like arrows and horns. They'd be gone before you fired a shot. They didn't need numbers, they had velocity. They didn't need a front line, they had the whole horizon. They weren't just nomads, they were the nightmare that chased the Confederado dreams of empire builders across Texas and New Mexico. It gets even more deliciously brutal when you realize their main diet was buffalo. And we're not talking tamer than food court nuggets. We're talking head cheese, tendon stew, and yes, marrow straight from freshly felled bones. While the rest of the world was busy domesticating cows and sheep, the Comanche turned buffalo into an all-you-can-eat survival buffet. They crafted portable teepees, buffalo hide prayer robes, and enough dried meat to outlast any siege. A plains famine was their version of holiday leftovers. By the mid-1800s, they had created a wall of domination that stretched from the Arkansas to the Rio Grande, putting a chokehold on Spanish missions, Mexican ranchos, and young Texian settlements alike. The phrase Comanche Empire might sound hyperbolic, but try explaining that to the 2,000 settlers who petitioned President Jackson to send in the National Guard and didn't get more than a polite suggestion to stay inside until further notice. Ironically, it was the arrival of the US Army that gave the Comanche their greatest tests and finest triumphs. The cavalry showed up in blue coats and shiny buttons, convinced they could school the savages with textbook drills. Instead, they learned that maps were worthless, bullseyes were a joke, and supply trains looked like juicy targets rolling through nothing but hostile territory. Each ambush became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Take a few commissary wagons, lay them out like a feast, and then disappear into a swirl of dust before anyone can send reinforcements. And let's not forget the diplomacy, because this isn't your run-of-the-mill history class. Imagine treaty talk over a pipe, punctuated by laughter when the white men realized the Comanche knew every loophole and every clause. Promises of peace, mixed with threats so polite you might thank them for drawing blood. Every time the US government sent agents to negotiate, they came back with a fistful of feathers, a few hooves, and a new respect for buffalo hunting archers. Survival on the plains wasn't just about battles, it was weather too. Winter storms could freeze a man's beard solid. Summer sun could bake your brain until you saw mirages of buffalo charging backwards. Yet the Comanche thrived. Their women maintained teepees slicker than boardrooms. Their horses bred faster than any thoroughbred. Their warriors moved with the kind of silent confidence that makes cliches about "born to ride" sound like unearned corporate slogans. By the 1850s, a smaller, better-armed U.S. force began to pin them down. Railroads, telegraphs, and industrial meatpacking made buffalo herds vanish faster than speculative stocks. But even then, the Comanche adapted, turning to raiding settlements for food, trading captives like currency, and relishing every skirmish as if it were a twisted carnival. They became legends, feared even by other tribes, carving out a reputation so fierce that Comanche became shorthand for apocalypse. Pause for a moment and picture the absurdity. Here's a people who started off hunting antelope on foot, then invented mobile warfare when they tamed wild horses and eventually forced an entire continental power to overhaul its military tactics just to keep up. These are not characters in a fantasy novel, they're the truth. They turned nature's harshest elements into an advantage, rewriting the rulebook on plains warfare and flowing brush strokes of irony and blood. But what about the personal stories? Imagine being a young warrior named Iron Hawk, your father's lance in your hand, your mare trembling beneath you as you glance at the smoke rising from a distant homestead. You know the men inside have never seen your kind dance across the horizon. They're blissfully ignorant of the sorrow you carry for every buffalo fallen to hide hungry hordes. You lean forward, feel your heart pound like a war drum, and you realize this is your world, and no treaty or cannon will ever change that. Yet, history is rarely fair. Epidemics swept through, trade goods dwindled, and the unstoppable herd of progress rolled over Comanche like a juggernaut. You'd adapt again, ghost dances, shifting alliances, selling ponies for rifles. But no matter how many westward dreams you trampled, the weight of an expanding nation pressed in. So here we are, in the lull between ambush and occupation, watching as the last Great Plains thunderheads roll across the horizon. You, dear listener, might be scrolling through your feed in some air-conditioned room, but back then, hearts thundered in unison with hooves. Each gust of prairie wind carried the scent of freedom and the stench of inevitability. Each dawn brought hope that maybe, just maybe, the Comanche Empire would outlast time itself, but it didn't. Not entirely. The Comanche spirit endures in the poetry of Red Earth, in the final echo of hoofbeats across a silent plain, in every whispered tale of survival against odds so absurd they defy belief. And if you think that's overdramatic, remember, they held back one of the world's most powerful military machines with little more than arrows, horses, and a will of iron. By the end of this first chapter, you should be itching for more. More tales of blistering desert chases, midnight raids under moonlight, and tribal councils dripping with sarcasm sharp enough to cut buffalo sinew. Next time, we'll dig into the pivotal battles, the betrayals, and the legends that shaped a people who refused to kneel. So, keep your stirrup leather oiled and your senses razor sharp, because the Comanche storm is just beginning. You blink back in from the dust storm of memory, and find yourself riding shotgun on a buffalo's skull-studded dirt road, the wind whistling death notices through the teepees of your mind. After yesterday's taste of Comanche omnipresence, today we plunge deeper into their masterpiece of chaos, tactics so baroque you'd swear they were drawn up by a bored trickster god with a sketch pad and a cruel sense of humor. The dawn of part 2 opens with a commotion in the village. You're roused by the snap of horsehair ropes and the low hum of whispered strategy. The elders have summoned a council. Teepees sway in the morning breeze like mottled flags of war. For a second, you think you see painted horsemen dancing across the sky, but it's just smoke drifting from the cooking pits. Inside the largest lodge, the circle assembles, warriors with braided hair, scalp locks dangling like talismans, women whose eyes have seen more grief than most armies combined, children who play with miniature bows, imitating the precise draw of a seasoned hunter. The air crackles with intent. "Today," intones old buffalo voice, his nose ring catching the sun, "we decide if the American road goes through our lands or we go through theirs." You half expect someone to whip out a map and a compass. Instead, the plan unfolds over clanks of bone dice, laughter, and cryptic references to spirit visits. This is not Versailles. It's Guerrilla Theory 101, taught by students who never plan to graduate. "They will come," one warrior says, hungry for revenge, their pockets heavy with treaties. "We will give them both, a treaty of dust, a revenge they can taste in their tea." Their first move is classic feint, a raiding party disguised as buffalo hunters. Painted horns on their faces, they ride in loose formation toward an isolated mill along the Canadian River. Onlookers cheer. They assume these are harmless Comanche brothers come to trade meat. Instead, the hunters circle the settlement at dawn, spears leveled, banishing any thought of parley. They load captured supplies onto pack horses and melt back into the tall grass, leaving nothing but overturned carts and a lingering dare. Meanwhile, deeper in the heart of Comancheria, a small war band prepares for an even more audacious stroke, an ambush of a military wagon train. Picture 30 horsemen under canvas of secrecy, led by a warrior named Raven Talon, tall as a sapling, grin wide enough to split skulls. By dusk, they've crept within earshot of mule clips and officer chatter. The soldiers joke about spending the night in friendly territory. At midnight, Raven Talon swings his horse out of the shadows, and the world erupts in sparks. Arrows hiss through the warm air. Lanterns shatter like stars. The soldiers panic, firing blanks into darkness. In half a minute, the wagons are Comanche property, the mules galloping off like startled ghosts. The raiders disappear before the wounded realize they've been robbed, their sleeping bags slashed into ribbons. By sunrise, campfires are cold and Comanche bread bakes on hot stones miles away. It's not all lightning raids. The Comanche also practice psychological warfare. One story tells of a lone warrior, Feathered Mirror, who wandered close to a frontier homestead at twilight, danced a silent war dance on the roof, then vanished like a mirage. The settlers fled, convinced the devil himself had come to claim their souls. Soon after, they abandoned the area altogether, chalking it up to unholy business. But let's talk numbers. At its peak, the Comanche mounted as many as 10,000 horsemen, though census takers in Washington scoffed at any number north of 1,000. Whether inflated or not, this mobile legion commanded respect. Imagine trying to stamp out a hydra whose heads multiply with every raid, whose horses breed faster than government ordinances can charter cavalry regiments. Agriculture in Comancheria is a study in improvisation. There are no neat rows of corn. Instead, women plant seeds in the river's floodplain, knowing seasonal inundation will water their fields. They patch earth with animal dung, chasing fertility like hunters after antelope. When a crop fails, they turn to prickly pear cactus for moisture, roasting its pads and snapping them into stews that taste like desert sunrises. Compare that to the settlers' imported wheat, which wilted under the relentless sun, and the irony is delicious. The supposed uncivilized thrived while farms collapsed. Cultural exchange gets twisted into comedy when Spanish traders arrive with iron kettles and cloth, only to find their goods used in ways never intended. Blankets for bedding become quiver lining. Pots become sacrificial cauldrons for ceremonial. Teas and cloth turns into stretchers for wounded warriors. Every trade, good is repurposed with a wink. You bring the iron, we'll bring the strategy. As the 1850s unfurl, alliances shift like desert sand. The Comanche court marriage alliances with Kiowa, Apache, and occasionally Ute bands, forming a ragged federation of convenience. When the brush tribes unite, it's like inviting every financial institution to a bank heist. Overwhelming force, multiple attack vectors, and the planners are schoolmasters of subterfuge. Then there were the betrayals. News arrives of peace talks at Council Springs. A dozen braves ride in good faith, expecting words and tobacco. Instead, they find themselves surrounded by Texan dragoons under a Union flag of truce. 2 warriors fall before the muskets roar. The rest flee into a hail of gunfire and insult. The Comanche howl in anger. "We invited you to speak, not to shoot." The episode spawns a wave of vengeance that echoes across every mesa. Still, diplomacy persists. Michael Gordon, a silver-tongued interpreter, half Comanche by birth, negotiates a shaky truce. Comanche agree to refrain from raids on marked settlements. Settlers vow to avoid sacred hunting grounds. Both sides deliver gifts, horse for rifle, beadwork for medals, and both parade the treaty as proof of superior civilization. In truth, it's a fragile accord signed in blood and sarcasm, destined to fray at the first midnight mugging. Intermittent skirmishes between the Comanche and U.S. cavalry supply a parade of near-mythical clashes. At Dove Creek, a detachment of 150 soldiers advances on a reported Comanche camp. They stumble into an ambush so perfectly choreographed that horses wheel, Soldiers break ranks, and half the unit retreats while the other half scrambles for cover behind overturned wagons. By sunset, tradition holds that no Texan under General Hardin bragged of surviving a Comanche lottery. One cannot overstate the role of horses. Stallions were treated like demigods. A prized black steed named Night Wind was said to outrun the rippling horizon itself. Her rider, a woman warrior called Moon Shadow, led charges that shattered infantry lines. When Night Wind died of old age, the mourning rituals lasted days. Songs, horsehair trimmings, and a final ride into the plains, where Moon Shadow whispered farewells into the breeze. Food logistics weave an equally surreal tapestry. As buffalo herds dwindle from commercial hides, the Comanche adapt by raiding Mexican caravan routes. Mule trains laden with flour and beans become prime targets. Mounted parties descend at dawn, pilfer sackfuls, and leave the mules behind, trading meat for cornmeal in a barter that confuses both sides and delights our ironic sensibilities. We take your provisions, they seem to say, because you clearly have enough to spare. Climate intervenes in dramatic acts. A late spring blizzard blankets the plains, catching horse herds off guard. Riders scramble to unearth buried mounts. Some horses perish, leaving warriors stranded for days beneath piles of snow. Yet Comanche ingenuity turns the disaster into opportunity. They fashion snow goggles from elk antler strips, carve windbreaks from pack drift, and slip through whiteouts to raid unsuspecting settlements wearing white-painted hides. By the late 1860s, the U.S. military pivots to a scorched earth policy: burn Comanche winter camps, slaughter stray horses, poison watering holes. The brutality awes and horrifies even hardened officers. Reports describe skeletal plains littered with broken bows and frayed lariat. "We fight a people who fight like ghosts," one colonel writes, "and now we must starve them from existence." Still, the Comanche endure. They become masters of concealment, splitting into small groups, living off roots and lizards, conducting hit-and-run attacks that seem to materialize from thin air. Their legend grows to myth. Tales circulate of a lone Comanche warrior emerging from a cave to rifle butt a U.S. officer, then slipping back inside before a patrol can fire. The war grinds on until exhaustion of horses, soldiers, treaties, and human resolve brings both sides to the edge. Smallpox and measles ravage Comancheria, sent unknowingly by traders and soldiers who mistake native vulnerability for divine favor. Whole villages empty, survivors huddle in squalid reservations. The once mighty empire crumbles under the weight of disease and displacement. Even then, the Comanche spirit refuses extinguishment. In exile at Fort Sill, they rebuild community through dance, poetry, and whispered legends of the old days, when arrows flew free and buffalo thundered like the heartbeat of the world. Their children learn both English and Comanche tongue, carrying dual identities like shields. As you drift away from this chapter, imagine the resonant power of a people who bent the course of American expansion without ever signing on the dotted line. They fought not for territory alone, but for the very air and sky above them, turning plains into battlegrounds of wit and will. Next time, we'll delve into the twilight of the Comanche Empire, the final confrontations, the forced marches to reservations, and the reclamation of cultural pride in the face of erasure. Keep your senses alert, because even in defeat, the Comanche storm left ripples across history that we still feel today. You wake to the low clang of iron chains rattling against wooden posts. No gentle dawn chorus here, just the harsh symphony of confinement. Gone are the endless horizons and blood-red sunsets you once knew. Instead, you're staring at a stockade fence that smells of sweat, fear, and broken promises. This is Fort Sill, circa 1875. The last stop before the American dream chews you up and spits you out. You step off your pony, once swift as Night Wind's offspring, now gaunt and limping, and find yourself herded with dozens of other Comanche into a corral the size of a postage stamp. The soldiers bark orders like they invented humanity. No talking, no hunting, no dancing. Of course, they forget the most important rule of plains survival. Where there's a will, there's always a way. Across the enclosure, you spot Quanah Parker, half Comanche, half white captive child turned fearsome war leader. His eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, still flash that trademark grin that once sent U.S. cavalry into tailspins. He strides forward, leather fringe flapping, and raises one hand. Silence falls. not because the soldiers ordered it, but because every man, woman, and child here remembers that grin heralds a story or a threat, sometimes both. Quanah speaks, his voice low as buffalo thunder, reminding everyone that surrender wasn't defeat. It was a strategic pause. He recounts the Red River War, those frantic months when Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho turned the Texas Panhandle into a mausoleum of military dreams. You recall how Colonel Mackenzie burned villages, slaughtered horses, and forced a dozen tribes to scatter like wounded deer. Yet, even under fire, your people fought with the stubborn choreography of survival. Hit fast, vanish faster, and never give the enemy a moment's rest. Now, confined in rows of shabby barracks, you realize that life on the reservation is warfare by other means. They've outlawed your dances, pounding drums and feathered regalia are now uncivilized stimulants. They've banned your language in schools. They seek to replace buffalo meat with government-issued beef so fatty it would choke a kitten. Every aspect of your culture becomes a crime scene. Still, you adapt. Under cover of night, women in calico dresses discreetly coax papooses to softly chant in Comanche. Furtive teepees dotted beyond the stockade feed clandestine councils. You barter prized arrows for stolen flour. You fashion finger puppets out of scraps to teach children sacred origin stories. The reservation becomes a hidden battlefield where small acts of defiance, painting a sweat lodge interior, wearing a bone whistle around your neck, are bullets you fire into the conqueror's heart. But let's not romanticize. Disease ravages the camp like an indiscriminate archer. Smallpox and influenza rip through families. You bury grandparents and infants in shallow graves, marking each mound with a prayer and a carved bone. The army doctor offers quinine and bad whiskey. You decline, preferring sweat lodge medicine and buffalo grass teas. When 2/3 of a band fall sick, you watch funeral teepees line the horizon like white flags of despair. Amid this bleakness, Quanah Parker strikes his own bargain. He negotiates with General Sherman, yes, that Sherman, offering to lead a peaceful transition in exchange for the right to maintain certain traditions and secure fair rations. The deal? You'll stop raiding, the government will supply meat, blankets, and clothing. You'll receive a modest allotment of land at the agency. The kicker, you must send your children to government schools. You watch young braves mount a final ride to the Indian Territory, their horses L-shaped silhouettes against the setting sun. Each hoofbeat echoes like a heartbeat of a dying world. You want to shout, "This isn't abandonment, it's strategic relocation," but the wind steals your cry. In silence, you fold up the last of your hunting bows and tuck them away where no soldier's bayonet can find them. On the long journey south, over dusty trails or through river fords swollen with rain, you glimpse other bands, Kiowa warriors singing laments, Cheyenne women rocking papooses, Arapaho elders bending under pack mules. You wonder if your ancestors ever imagined trading the Great Plains for an agency allotment. Yet, even in that quiet despair, you sense the spark of something fierce, a people's will to survive beyond trauma. Arriving at Fort Sill, you're assigned a small tract of land to farm. Army officers draw neat grids on paper as if land were a chessboard to be played. They hand you plows and hoes, expecting you to cultivate half-breed wheat. You glance at the horizon, empty of buffalo, and at the man handing you the plow, his boots caked in red mud, and you realize you're meant to become farmers in a world that once scoffed at mules and wheat. Yet, even the plow becomes a canvas of irony. You carve sacred symbols into its wooden handle. You chant soft blessings laid upon seed furrows. You dig trenches for corn and beans with the same meticulous care you once reserved for battlefield fortifications. Each sprout reminds you that life persists even when forced into iron harness. Schoolhouse bells ring at dawn, another invasion. Your children march off to learn English arithmetic and gospel hymns. They return speaking in clipped tones, proudly reciting multiplication tables, yet stumble when asked to name the Comanche words for buffalo, lightning, or mourning dove. Still, you smile, knowing that a bilingual soul is twice armed for survival. After all, to outwit the conqueror, you must master his language. But resistance finds new forms. You hold secret dances in barn lofts, smuggling in buckskin regalia. You weave traditional blankets behind closed doors. You recite creation myths under moonlit skies, teaching your children that when the last buffalo falls, The spirits will speak through cedar smoke. It's a dangerous game. If caught, you face lashings or starvation rations. But your people are masters at turning risk into ritual. Meanwhile, trade posts near the agency sprout like mushrooms in damp darkness. White merchants sell sugar, coffee, and cheap trinkets. You learn to haggle with a grin, trading handmade beadwork, sacred patterns etched over generations, for cloth and coffee beans. The irony is delicious. You barter the soul of your heritage to buy a taste of the conqueror's brew. As the 1880s dawn, you witness a new generation of Comanche. Lean adolescents with braided hair and denim trousers, blending cultures like they blend paints. They carry Colt revolvers instead of bows, but still cut their hair into the sacred top knot. They wear the rosary next to a bone fetish. They ride step ponies but listen to gospel choirs. In them, you see hope interlaced with sorrow, a tapestry of adaptation. Among these youths is a boy named Yellow Wolf, who tells you of dreams where buffalo herds thunder again, and Comanche legends stir under the red moon. He sketches visions on paper, horses galloping over railroad tracks, elders dancing in the dawn mist, and you realize that his imagination is a weapon sharper than any arrow. With it, he refuses to accept the reservation as the end of history. At the annual sun dance, finally permitted under heavy military watch, you slip into the circle with half the community watching like hawks. You dance for days, flesh pierced with bone skewers, chanting for renewal. Some soldiers pass by, puzzled, clutching sabers, unsure whether to intervene. But the dance is complete in its urgency. You reforge bonds with ancestors, affirm your right to exist as Comanche. And then, just as all great ceremonies end, you step back into the post-ceremony quiet. You feel the scars, both physical and spiritual, but you also feel a pulse. A melody of memory, resistance, and persistence. The government catalogs your land and livestock in meticulous ledgers. You catalog your culture in dances, stories, and secret rituals. Both archives exist side by side, like twin cedar poles holding up the sky. By the close of Part 3, you understand that the Comanche Empire did not die with the Red River War. It mutated, survived punishing weather, brutal policy, and hostile disease. By blending adaptation with cultural tenacity, you, standing on that patch of red dirt at Fort Sill, are living proof that the human spirit, when forged in the furnace of survival, emerges tempered, unbreakable. Next time, we'll venture beyond the stockade fences to chart how modern Comanche reclaim language, build economic enterprises, and navigate the dizzying contradictions of 21st century America while carrying the weight of their ancestors' thunder. Keep your senses sharp, for the story of a people who once thundered across the plains is far from over. You return to the present, but the past still hums beneath your boots. Part 4 opens on the windswept plains of today, a landscape both familiar and alien, where cell towers sprout like metal badger holes and oil pumps thump in a rhythm that drowns out buffalo thunder. The Comanche Nation now spans thousands of square miles of reservation and trust lands in Oklahoma, dotted with casinos, wind farms, and ancestral healing centers. Yet, behind each new enterprise lies a history of resilience sharp enough to carve through steel. You step into the Comanche Nation headquarters in Lawton, where portraits of Quanah Parker and other ancestors gaze from polished walls. The lobby smells of fresh coffee and cedar incense, a blend of modern caffeine kick and ritual smoke. You pass glass display cases of ledger art, buffalo hide canvases painted with visions of old hunts and treaty signings. Each stroke whispers, "We're still here." First stop, language revitalization. You enter a classroom where elders and teens sit in a circle, reciting Comanche vocabulary like a war chant. The teacher, Ms. White Buffalo, calls out words in rapid succession: Comanchea, Pa Umutuk, Tushka, and the students repeat, stumbling, then gaining confidence. Every syllable cracked open the door to the past, names of spirits, rivers, dances. You realize that each reclaimed word is a thunderclap against centuries of forced silence. It's absurd, you think, that a language nearly driven to extinction now roars back in digital apps, online courses, and interactive games that teach children how to say horse the way their ancestors did. From language, you cross the street to the Comanche Nation Casino. Picture slot machines flashing neon buffalo heads and poker tables where the river card is occasionally dealt by a dealer named Red Feather. You watch as locals and tourists alike feed quarters into machines, hopeful for jackpots that could pay for a month's groceries. On the surface, it's pure capitalism disguised as entertainment, but the profits funnel back into health clinics, scholarship programs, and elder care. This is modern guerrilla warfare of another kind, using blinking lights and house odds to fund tribal services. The irony: a people once demonized as gamblers on horseback now navigate gaming compacts with the state, wielding legal loopholes like scalp locks of power. Next, you tour the wind energy project in western Comanche lands. Towering turbines spin against an endless blue backdrop. You meet the project manager, a Comanche engineer named Skyrunner, whose degree in renewable energy was paid for by gaming revenues. She explains how the tribe negotiated land leases with developers, transforming dusty plains into green energy fields. Each turbine is a steel teepee, she quips, capturing wind instead of buffalo. The project supplies power to thousands of homes and reduces carbon emissions, an audacious echo of your ancestors' ability to harness natural forces for survival. You then visit the health clinic where traditional and Western medicine intertwine. In one room, a nurse offers flu vaccines. Next door, a medicine man brews cedar and sweetgrass for a sweat lodge ceremony. Patients flow between sterile exam rooms and sweat lodges, carrying both antibiotics and ritual prayers. It's an absurd fusion. EKG machines share hallways with drumming circles. Yet it works. Chronic disease rates decline. Elders find solace in ceremonies, and toddlers learn early that healing can mean both pills and prayers. Education gets its own chapter. The Comanche Nation College stands on a hill overlooking Lawton, its architectural lines blending glass and timber to honor teepees and modern halls alike. You attend a lecture on tribal law, where a young lawyer, Eagle Voice, debates sovereignty with students live streaming to other tribes. They parse Supreme Court decisions, draft ordinances, and negotiate compacts. These sessions are ironic battlefields, pen and paper treaties fought again in courtrooms and council chambers rather than open plains. The students graduate ready to protect water rights, run casinos, and draft bilingual curriculum that weaves Comanche history into U.S. textbooks. But not everything sparkles. You hear about housing shortages, trailers squeezed onto small lots, families sharing kitchens in overcrowded homes. You meet a grandmother whose pipestone workshop doubles as her living room because rent is too high. She teaches beadwork and quill work to her grandchildren in cramped quarters, sending finished pieces to museums in Europe, once the same people who called her ancestors savages. You feel the painful twist. The art that repels prejudice now fetches high prices abroad, yet those who create it often struggle to pay utility bills. Economic diversification becomes the next focus. You accompany tribal farmers planting buffalo on a ranch cooperative. Rangers herd 1,000 animals across fenced pastures, simultaneously restoring an ecosystem and creating a meat processing business. Their buffalo burgers end up in grocery stores across Oklahoma, marketed as heritage beef with a smiley bison logo. Each bite tells a story of extinction and revival, of treaties broken and promises kept by the people whose land you walk on. Cultural events pulse through the year. The Comanche National Cultural Festival attracts thousands for powwows, rodeos, and art fairs. You step into a grand arena where dancers in vibrant regalia compete for prizes. The drum circle throbs like a biological echo, hearts synchronized with 17th century hunts. Nearby, quilters stitch narrative quilts depicting the Red River War, and poets recite verses in Comanche and English, creating bilingual wordscapes that wander between worlds. Technology seeps in, too. You visit the Comanche Language App Development Lab, where coders build interactive modules with audio clips of elders speaking, quizzes on verb conjugations, and augmented reality teepees that appear through your smartphone camera. Kids collect digital tokens for every correctly spoken sentence, unlocking virtual artifacts, like a painted hide or ceremonial headdress. You marvel at this alchemy, ancient oral traditions encoded as lines of code, ensuring that even the most disconnected urban youth can hear the echo of their forebears. Political engagement intensifies. You attend a tribal council meeting where leaders debate a resolution to oppose nearby fracking operations threatening aquifers. Younger members stream the debate on social media, tagging state senators and drawing nationwide support. It's a direct continuation of the guerrilla diplomacy practiced by Old Buffalo Voice centuries ago, Only now the arsenal is tweets, petitions, and environmental impact statements, yet global connections emerge. You witness Comanche delegates at United Nations forums on indigenous rights, standing alongside Sami, Maori, and Sapara representatives. They share strategies for land protection and cultural preservation, trading stories of survival that harmonize across continents. The Comanche, once isolated on the southern plains, now claim a seat at the world stage, wielding international law as deftly as they once did the lance. All this progress bubbles under the surface of everyday struggle. You talk to a young father teaching his daughter how to braid hair and speak her native tongue. He admits fear of cultural dilution, of identity loss in an age of digital distraction. He scrolls through TikTok videos that mock Indians wearing feather headdresses at festivals. Then he switches to a Comanche language channel where elders tell creation stories. He sighs, we're juggling two worlds. And you realize the true comedy and tragedy lies in this balancing act, honoring ancestors while navigating highways and Wi-Fi. Finally, your journey ends at the Comanche cemetery outside Cache. You walk among headstones in English and Comanche, some simple granite markers, others carved buffalo stone monoliths. You pause at Quanah Parker's grave, the namesake of so many battles and bargains, his headstone plain yet dignified. Quanah Parker, Chief, 1845 to 1911. A fresh wreath of cedar rests at its base, placed by descendants who still feel his spirit in the wind. The cemetery gate is flanked by wind chimes made of arrowheads and metal spoons, tinkling softly in the breeze, a modern tribute to an old world where every sound carried meaning. You leave feeling the pull of contradiction. Here is a people who once thundered across the plains with bows and arrows, now steering high-tech apps and energy policy, who endured chains and stockades, now drafting their own laws and educating their youth. The Comanche Empire never truly fell, it transformed. Survival, after all, is the supreme twist of history. You adapt or you vanish. And these descendants of Ironhawk and Moonshadow prove that adaptation can be a ballet of irony, courage, and relentless cultural pride. As the credits of this narrative roll, you settle into the echo of hoofbeats, digital and clay, rifle and keyboard, knowing that the Comanche story continues with each spoken word, each board meeting, each ceremony under the sky. So dim the lights again, turn that fan on, and listen. The plains still whisper, even through the hum of progress. Hey guys, imagine waking up in the desert with your mouth full of sand, your canteen empty, and your enemies already dead before they realized they were being hunted. Now imagine the people who did that, year after year, in sandals made from yucca leaves. This isn't a movie, this was real. And the men and women who pulled it off weren't just warriors, they were shadows with knives. If the Comanche ruled the plains with speed, the Apache ruled the mountains with silence. This is the story of the ghost warriors of the desert. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. You wake up in a landscape that shouldn't allow life at all. Everything here is sharp. The rocks cut your fingers, the cacti stab your ankles, and even the wind tries to flay you alive. Welcome to Apache country, where survival wasn't just hard, it was high art. You're in the heart of the American Southwest, sometime around the early 1700s, and if you're not from here, you're already in danger. The Spanish called them Apaches de guerra, Apaches of war, as if war was their full-time profession and not just Tuesday afternoon. And to be fair, the Spanish had reasons to panic. Their caravans disappeared, their forts burned in the night. Whole patrols marched out and were never seen again, except maybe as scattered bones on a sun-bleached trail. The Apache didn't need fortresses or battalions. They had something better: mountains, silence, and an infinite patience for watching you make the first mistake. These weren't your classic warriors riding out in full armor with trumpets. No, the Apache moved like they were made of smoke and bad omens. They could slip across 70 miles of rocky terrain in a single night, climb vertical cliffs barefoot, and appear behind your outpost before you even heard a twig snap. One Spanish officer described them as a breeze that kills. Another just stopped writing altogether after his command vanished near the Sierra Madre. And the absurdity begins early. The Apache didn't build cities, they didn't build empires. They didn't even leave behind stone ruins for archaeologists to swoon over. Instead, they mastered mobility. Villages were temporary, camps moved like chess pieces. One day, you're sleeping in a canyon. The next day, you've melted into the scrub and are living off pine nuts and roasted agave. It's like trying to fight ghosts with a calendar. You would not survive a week out here. First, you'd lose your boots to a yucca thorn. Then you'd drink from the wrong pool and meet a scorpion with anger issues. Then the sun would roast you like a chicken forgotten in an iron skillet. Meanwhile, an Apache child half your size is already setting rabbit traps and grinding mesquite beans for the family. They didn't just survive the desert, they made it nervous. Now, picture this. You're a settler in northern Mexico. You've got a small ranch, 2 goats, and a false sense of security. You go to sleep one night thinking your musket and adobe walls will protect you. By sunrise, your goats are gone, your well is poisoned, and your barn is on fire. You scream into the hills, but the hills don't scream back. They never do. Somewhere out there, an Apache war party is already 50 miles away, carrying your stuff and laughing about your goat's name. And here's the kicker. This wasn't some centralized war machine. The Apache weren't one tribe. They were a constellation of independent groups: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Western Apache, each with their own leaders, their own dialects, and their own very personal grudges. If they agreed on anything, it was that anyone who stepped onto their land without an invitation deserved a particularly creative form of suffering. The Spanish tried everything. They built presidios, forts with stone walls and garrisons of poorly paid soldiers. They offered rations, horses, guns. They sent in priests to convert the Apache to the one true faith. The priests disappeared, the guns got stolen, and the presidios? Let's just say the walls didn't help much when Apache warriors were already inside, disguised as friendly traders or simply climbing down the cliff behind the fort like lizards with bad tempers. And don't imagine the Apache as stone-faced warriors with no sense of humor. Their wit was as sharp as their obsidian blades. They mocked their enemies openly. Spanish records include stories of Apache raiders leaving behind cactus arrangements shaped like obscene gestures, or bundles of stolen uniforms worn backwards just to humiliate the wearer. One governor reportedly lost 3 horses, 2 wagons, and his wig in a single raid. The wig later turned up on an Apache dog. But let's get personal. Let's meet a young boy named Goyakla. He lives with his family in a small Chiricahua band. They trade occasionally with the Mexicans. Sometimes things are peaceful, until they're not. One evening, while he's away hunting, a Mexican militia raids his camp. His mother, wife, and 3 children are killed. Goyakla returns to find ash, blood, and silence. Something breaks in him. That boy becomes Geronimo. And if you think you've heard that name before, it's because American paratroopers later screamed it while jumping out of planes, hoping to borrow just a fraction of his terrifying spirit. But we're not there yet. For now, Goyakla, soon to be Geronimo, isn't a legend. He's a broken man with a knife, a rifle, and the kind of rage that makes empires nervous. He joins up with leaders like Cochise, Mangas Coloradas, Victorio, men who've turned survival into a philosophy. Their raids are precision strikes. Their hideouts are stone labyrinths high in the hills, impossible to reach unless you know the land, and they always know the land. The Apache didn't fight to conquer, they fought to exist. They fought because every treaty signed with a colonizer was treated like a napkin at a wedding, smiled at, then tossed aside when inconvenient. They fought because their women were kidnapped, their fields torched, their elders hanged for crimes like possessing weapons while Apache. They fought because no one else would stand between them and annihilation. And here's a historical absurdity for you. By the mid-1800s, the United States government steps in, all starched collars and manifest destiny. They think they've seen hard wars, Mexico, the Civil War, even the Comanche. But nothing prepares them for chasing a people who treat maps like suggestions and forts like jokes. The army sends scouts. The Apache vanish. They send entire regiments. The Apache lead them in circles until their horses collapse. At one point, an entire campaign in the Arizona mountains ends with the troops mutinying, not from enemy fire, but from thirst and exhaustion. Meanwhile, Apache children are learning to shoot rifles before they can spell their own names. Girls are trained in survival, horsemanship, medicine, and tracking. Elders remember every mountain pass, every trickle of seasonal water, every cave wide enough to hide a family, but narrow enough to block an army. And when things get dire, they don't surrender, they disappear. Into ravines, into forests, into the pages of legend. By the 1860s, the US government is throwing up its hands. They offer rations, they offer land, they build reservations. The Apache accept, then escape. They sign peace accords, then raid when those promises are broken, again and again and again. Because let's face it, if your enemy moves like smoke and hides in shadows, how do you pin them down long enough to colonize them? And that, dear listeners, is where we'll pause, because the ghosts of the desert haven't yet finished whispering. Next time, we'll ride into the heart of the Apache Wars, through blood-soaked canyons, betrayal-stained treaties, and the final bitter exile of Geronimo. But for now, remember this: no army, no empire, no faith, no rail line ever truly conquered the Apache. They just outlasted them, barely, and not without bruises. The desert remembers, and so will we. Let's pick up right where we left off, on the edge of madness, in the land where maps meant nothing, and even time had to ask the Apache for directions. Last time, we met Goyakla, the man who would become Geronimo. But this isn't just about one man. This is about an entire way of life, slipping like water through the fingers of every empire that tried to grip it. You want the next chapter? Good, because it gets darker, it gets bloodier, and yes, it gets more absurd. It's the 1860s now, and America is officially a mess. The Civil War is tearing the eastern half of the country apart, and out west? Out west, a different kind of war is brewing, one that's less about ideology and more about terrain, weather, water, and a very angry people with absolutely nothing left to lose. The US Army is exhausted. They've just finished getting bayoneted by their own citizens, and now they're being asked to saddle up again. This time to deal with the Apache. This is like asking someone who just crawled out of a burning house to go chase hornets through a volcano. So what do? They send General George Crook, a man with a beard that looked like it could punch you, and eyes that had seen too much. Crook wasn't stupid. He knew traditional warfare didn't work. So he did something wild. He hired Apache scouts to hunt other Apache. Let that sink in. The government tried to fight Apache, using Apache. Now this wasn't some clean tactical move. It was betrayal layered on desperation. Many of these scouts had been coerced, threatened, or simply out of options. They guided troops through deadly canyons, tracked footprints in rock-hard soil, and warned against ambushes only they could see coming. Without them, the army would have wandered into 100 dry gulches and never come out. But even then, even with native guides and repeating rifles and railroads coughing coal smoke across the land, victory stayed out of reach. Why? Because you can't win a game when your opponent refuses to play by your rules. And the Apache didn't just change the rules. They burned them, buried them, and taught their children never to speak of them again. By the 1870s, something truly insane is happening. The US is spending more money chasing a few thousand Apache than they did on entire Union campaigns. Telegraph lines are being strung through hostile land just to keep up. Thousands of soldiers are chasing maybe 200 fighters across thousands of square miles. And still, they can't catch them. One officer wrote in his journal, "They are not men. They are ghosts, and they do not tire." And here's the bitter irony. The Apache weren't fighting to win, they were fighting to survive. But survival, to the American government, looked a lot like resistance. And resistance, in the 19th century, got you labeled as a terrorist. Let's talk about Cochise. You've heard the name, maybe on a highway sign or an old western. But Cochise wasn't just a warrior. He was a thunderstorm wrapped in flesh. He didn't want war. At first, he tried diplomacy, but then came the infamous Bascom affair. Here's what happened. A boy is kidnapped. A young army officer named Bascom blames Cochise. Cochise says, "I didn't do it." Bascom doesn't believe him. So what does Bascom do? He lures Cochise in for talks, and then tries to arrest him. Cochise escapes, but his family is taken hostage. In retaliation, Cochise kidnaps Americans. A standoff begins. Both sides kill prisoners. And just like that, diplomacy dies. Apache raids ignite like wildfire. You might think, okay, surely now the US government learned not to mess this up again. Ha? Number. They doubled down. More troops, more broken treaties, more peace offerings that turned out to be traps. It was like trying to bribe a lion with beef jerky and then acting shocked when it eats your face. Cochise retreats into the Dragoon Mountains, and this is where things get cinematic. Imagine sheer cliffs, winding canyons, sudden storms, and in the middle of it, a small band of Apache slipping through the rocks like shadows. The army chases, stumbles, retreats, returns, fails. One sergeant writes, "We lost men and mules. I think the rocks killed more of us than the Apaches did." Eventually, Cochise agrees to peace, but only after 10 years of blood. A reservation is made, the Chiricahua agree to settle, and for a moment it seems like maybe the worst is over. But it's not. It's never over, because then comes the slow strangulation. Supplies promised in treaties arrive late or not at all. The land given is too dry to farm. The agents sent to oversee the Apache steal, cheat, and lie. Slowly, starvation creeps in, disease follows, and so, inevitably, does rebellion. Now Geronimo steps into the spotlight. If Cochise was the storm, Geronimo is the lightning bolt that follows. He doesn't just fight, he haunts. He moves between Mexico and the US like a ghost, raiding settlements, eluding capture, then disappearing into the Sierra Madre like a whisper. The US throws everything at him: troops, scouts, bloodhounds, diplomats. Nothing works. At one point, Geronimo and 36 followers are being hunted by over 5,000 US and Mexican soldiers, and they still can't catch him. It's less a war than a cosmic joke being played by the desert. Meanwhile, the public in the East is freaking out. Newspapers portray Geronimo as a devil, a savage, a madman. But what they don't show are the reasons. The slaughtered families, the broken treaties, the desecrated graves. Geronimo wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting because every inch of land the government gave was eventually taken back. Every promise was a lie written in sand. And the irony? Geronimo was never a chief. He wasn't even supposed to lead. He was a spiritual warrior, driven by visions, loss, and something deeper than revenge, something like duty to a dying people. He raided into Mexico, striking at towns and soldiers who had hunted Apache like animals. He struck at settlers who built fences across sacred land, and always he moved like the wind, fast, unseen, and impossible to track for more than a day. The US military began to look ridiculous. Campaigns lasted months, then years. Officers quit. Maps were redrawn weekly. Soldiers died of thirst, heat stroke, or sheer confusion. One unit spent weeks tracking what turned out to be their own footprints in reverse. Eventually, the US sends General Nelson Miles, a man known for wearing immaculate uniforms and writing long-winded reports about nothing. Miles is determined to end this. He surrounds Geronimo with thousands of troops, fortifies the border, and, still, fails. In the end, it wasn't bullets that stopped Geronimo, it was betrayal. An Apache scout, yes, another one, convinced him to come in for peace talks. Geronimo, worn down by years of flight, agrees, but the government lied, again. Geronimo and his followers are imprisoned, then exiled, far from their homeland into Florida and later Alabama, where the air was thick with humidity and the ground was nothing like the desert, and that, you'd think, would be the end. But even in exile, Geronimo wouldn't stop haunting America. He became a symbol, first of fear, then of regret, and finally of mythology. He rode in Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration parade, he signed autographs, he sold buttons, and every time he smiled for the camera, you could almost see the pain underneath, the knowledge that his people were still scattered, still dispossessed, still ghosts in their own land. This is what makes the Apache story so unbearable. They were never truly beaten. They were worn down, stretched, lied to, starved, pushed to the brink and beyond. But they were never conquered in the way empires like to claim victory. So now, when you drive across Arizona or look at a dusty peak in New Mexico, remember, the silence you hear isn't peace. It's the echo of footsteps that once vanished like mist over stone. It's the breath of warriors who refused to vanish quietly. And next time, in part 3, we'll peel back even more layers. Reservation life, forced assimilation, and the strange way America tried to turn these ghost warriors into mascots, museum exhibits, and tourist attractions. Because history, when it can't kill you, will try to sell you. But not yet, not today. Today, the desert still remembers. And so do we. Hey guys, Welcome back to the heat-soaked edge of history, where the air is dry, the treaties are fake, and the ghosts don't rest easy. We've tracked the Apache from sacred mountains to snake-riddled plains, from resistance to betrayal. But now, we enter the strangest chapter of all. When the war didn't end, it just changed clothes. You thought it was over after Geronimo was exiled. Oh no, that was just the intermission. Now begins the slow death. The kind where everything still looks alive from a distance, where the body twitches, but the soul is already gone. It's the early 1900s. Geronimo is a prisoner of war, not a metaphorical one, a literal one. He's sent to a human military base in Alabama, a place as foreign to him as the moon. The desert that shaped him, that carved his bones like wind on sandstone, is now hundreds of miles away. The humidity alone must have felt like punishment. And here's where the absurdity kicks in. Because while Geronimo is technically imprisoned, he's also famous. He becomes a bizarre celebrity. Newspaper reporters line up to interview him. Photographers beg for his portrait. White Americans, many of whose parents once screamed at the very mention of his name, now want his autograph. He even rides in Theodore Roosevelt's 1905 inauguration parade. Let me repeat that. The same man who eluded the U.S. Army for years, the so-called savage of the Southwest, ends up in a top hat on horseback in Washington, D.C., waving to crowds. It's the strangest kind of full circle. Not redemption, not reconciliation, just pageantry. A man turned into a souvenir. But don't let the tuxedo fool you. Geronimo never stopped asking to go home. He wrote letters, made speeches, pleaded with generals and presidents. "Let me die in my own land," he said. "Let my bones rest in the earth I was born on." They said no, again and again, because even in captivity, Geronimo was still dangerous, not with weapons, but with memory. Let's zoom out. Across the West, Apache people are being funneled into reservation life. And by life, I mean an engineered catastrophe. Picture it, a stretch of barren land, chosen not for its beauty or abundance, but for how thoroughly useless it is. A place where nothing grows, where the rivers are dry or poisoned, and where every sunrise feels like a dare. The rations, moldy flour, rancid meat, sometimes no food at all. The education, white-run schools where children are beaten for speaking their own language. The churches, preachers who talk of sin while stealing sacred relics. The medicine, quack remedies, if any, delivered by people who don't know the difference between a fever and a curse. But the most brutal tool of all, boredom, forced inactivity, a psychological weapon. The Apache had once lived in constant motion, hunting, raiding, scouting, trading, dancing, training, praying. Now they were told to sit, to wait, to farm land that wouldn't yield, to forget their names and learn new ones, Christian ones, John, Paul, Mary, names that didn't echo off canyon walls. The children, especially, were targeted, sent to boarding schools far from their families, shaved bald, dressed in wool and leather shoes, punished for speaking Apache, taught that their parents were savages, their gods were lies, and their memories useless. This wasn't assimilation, this was erasure, weaponized amnesia. And yet, somehow, they survived. Secret languages whispered under blankets at night, sacred rituals hidden in the rhythms of daily life, songs smuggled into lullabies, stories disguised as bedtime tales. It was survival through camouflage. Meanwhile, America moves on. The railroads connect coast to coast. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show travels the country, and guess who makes guest appearances? That's right, real Apache warriors dressed in feathers and war paint, acting out raids for cheering crowds in cities that once feared them. It's grotesque. And it's genius. America can't kill its native population outright, so it turns them into myths, into background characters, into entertainment, into mascots, the noble savage, the stoic warrior, the wise elder, all while ignoring the fact that these people are still alive, still suffering, still resisting in their own quiet ways. Let's talk about the Fort Sill Apache. After years of exile in Florida and Alabama, a group is eventually allowed to relocate to Oklahoma, a land of tornadoes, broken promises, and bureaucrats with clipboards. They try to rebuild. They form communities. They plant gardens. They send their kids to schools and pray the teachers are kind this time. Some convert to Christianity, others pretend to. They learn to blend in just enough to survive, but the trauma doesn't vanish. Imagine being a child in 1910, raised by parents who speak a language the government calls illegal. Imagine growing up on stories of ancestors who flew through the desert like spirits, and now watching those same ancestors sweep floors in government buildings or dig ditches for towns that used to fear them. It's not a tragedy with a clean ending. It's a wound that keeps opening. Back in Washington, politicians talk about progress. They passed the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, finally granting Native Americans the right to vote. Sounds good, right? Except many states still find loopholes to block them. Literacy tests, land requirements, poll taxes, democracy, but make it optional. In 1940, World War II breaks out, and once again, the US asks the Apache to fight, and many do. Brave, decorated, loyal. But that loyalty is complicated, because while some see it as a chance to prove themselves, others see it as betrayal. Fighting for a flag that once tried to erase you is not a simple decision. And when those Apache soldiers return, medals in hand, they come back to the same poverty, the same reservations, the same whispered questions. What did we win? But in that quiet, something else begins to grow. The Apache don't disappear. They reorganize. They file lawsuits. They reclaim land. They run for office. They teach their language to the next generation. They start museums, tell their own stories, and slowly, agonizingly, begin to stitch themselves back into a nation that still doesn't quite know how to look them in the eye. Geronimo dies in 1909, far from home. His final request, to return to Arizona, is denied. He is buried in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and yet his spirit never really stayed there. Because every time an Apache child learns their true name, every time a ceremony is held on sacred ground, every time a story is told without apology, he returns. Not as a myth, not as a mascot, but as memory made flesh. Next time, in the final part of our journey, we'll look at the 20th and 21st centuries, how Apache resilience turned into revival, how the same desert that once hid warriors now cradles nations, how a people survived erasure by becoming unforgettable. But for now, just sit with this. A nation that tried to bury the Apache ended up building roads and towns on top of their bones, and still the roots push through. Still, the desert remembers, and so do we. The story of the Apache didn't end with captivity, erasure, or even the death of Geronimo. It only changed form. Like smoke in a canyon, it slipped between the fingers of those who thought they could grasp it. Now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, it's no longer just a story of survival. It's a story of return. You see, history doesn't vanish. It festers, it simmers, and then it erupts, often in the most bureaucratic, unromantic, and gloriously stubborn ways possible. Take land reclamation. After a century of being pushed, prodded, and penned into places no one else wanted, the Apache began to push back, this time with lawyers. Yes, lawyers. Not warriors on horseback, but warriors in suits. They showed up with boxes of documents, maps older than most states, and ancestral claims backed by every broken treaty America ever signed. One case stood out, the fight for Mount Graham. Sacred to the Western Apache, this towering peak in Arizona wasn't just a mountain. It was a pillar of spiritual life, a celestial staircase. But in the 1980s, scientists decided it was the perfect spot for a high-powered telescope. Progress, science, sky gazing. What could go wrong? Well, everything. The Apache protested, they sued, they prayed, they blocked roads. And while the observatory was eventually built, the battle ignited a new wave of cultural resistance. It wasn't just about saving land anymore. It was about replanting roots, reclaiming language, rebuilding memory. And speaking of memory, remember the children once punished for speaking Apache? Their grandchildren now teach that language in classrooms. Across reservations, immersion schools popped up. Little kids learn Apache before they learn English. Elders record oral histories, digitize chants, preserve grammar. It's a slow, beautiful resurrection, like rain falling on cracked earth. It doesn't look like much at first, but then something green starts to push through. Now, let's talk economy, because nothing says modern warrior like beating capitalism at its own game. Enter the Apache-run enterprises, ski resorts, gas stations, renewable energy projects, and yes, casinos. Cue the irony. The very people once called savages for resisting manifest destiny now own multi-million-dollar gaming operations where tourists from Phoenix and Albuquerque come to lose their paychecks under neon lights. But these aren't just money-making schemes. The revenue funds hospitals, schools, housing, infrastructure. They bankroll language programs, environmental restoration, elder care. The roulette wheel spins, and behind it, resistance hums. And the Apache don't just build businesses, they build policy. In 2016, the San Carlos Apache led a fierce campaign against a mining project in Oak Flat, another sacred site targeted by corporations and quietly sold off through a congressional land swap buried deep in a defense bill. The fight is ongoing. Sometimes it's in courtrooms, sometimes on the streets, sometimes in social media storms. Hashtags like # save Oak Flat. But always, it's rooted in survival. The Apache now run tribal governments. They send representatives to Congress. They sue federal agencies and win. They've learned the rules of the empire that once tried to erase them, and now they bend those rules into weapons. But don't get it twisted, this isn't a tidy redemption arc. There are still reservations plagued by poverty, addiction, unemployment, and historical trauma that hangs in the air like smoke. Suicide rates remain high. Healthcare is inconsistent. The scars of colonization aren't gone, they're just better dressed. Yet within that, there's joy. Real, defiant joy. There are powwows where dancers wear regalia that once had to be hidden in caves. There are weddings performed in both English and Apache, under both Christian crosses and ancient sun symbols. There are ceremonies under desert stars where teenagers chant the same songs sung by warriors who once rode against the cavalry. And there's humor. Because if there's one thing colonizers never managed to kill, it's the Apache gift for sarcasm. Jokes about government inefficiency, boarding school food, and white people getting lost in the desert after 5 minutes. Humor as resistance, as armor, as medicine. And yes, Geronimo is still with us. His name was co-opted by paratroopers in World War II, yelling Geronimo as they jumped from planes, an odd tribute. Strange considering how hard the U.S. tried to silence him, but now his descendants work to protect his legacy. His great-grandson Harlan Geronimo spent decades trying to repatriate his ancestors' remains, claiming they were stolen by members of the Skull and Bone Society at Yale. Absurd? Maybe, but not impossible. Because when history is written by grave robbers and thieves, you have to dig deeper to find the truth. And here's one more absurd twist for you. The US military named a drone program after him. Yes, the same military that hunted him now flies unmanned killing machines bearing his name. It's the kind of irony that makes you laugh until you cry. But the Apache remember the real Geronimo. Not the icon, not the slogan, the man, the father, the fugitive, the freedom fighter. He once said, "I was born on the prairies where the wind blew free, there was nothing to break the light of the sun." And now, long after the cavalry disbanded, long after the treaties faded, that sun still rises over Apache land. So what are we left with? A people who were hunted, captured, displayed, mocked, silenced, and who still refused to vanish. A desert that outlived the soldiers who tried to tame it. A name that echoes not in war cries, but in classrooms, courtrooms, and tribal councils. This isn't a ghost story, this is a resurrection. So the next time you drive through the Southwest and see a dry riverbed or a jagged peak or an old trading post, listen carefully. The wind still carries whispers in Apache. The land still breathes the names of those who walked before. They were never silent, they were just waiting for you to hear. Thanks for walking through the fire with me, and if you made it this far, hit that like, drop a comment, and tell me where you are in the world. History's not dead, it's just badly archived. Let's unearth it together. Imagine a nation so fierce, so adaptable, so flat out unbreakable, that the United States government signed treaty after treaty with them, then tore each one up like wet paper only to find these people still standing. Not just standing, riding, resisting, remembering. Today we're diving into the Lakota, the horse lords of the northern plains, the dreamers of visions, the reason why the stars of manifest destiny didn't shine quite as bright. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. and let's dive together into today's journey. To understand why the Lakota couldn't be broken, you first need to understand the geography of arrogance. You see, 19th century American politicians believed two things with absolute confidence. First, that all indigenous nations could be either tricked or slaughtered into submission, and second, that the Great Plains, those endless rolling hills of grass and sky, were just a temporary nuisance on the way to the West Coast, a brief blur between real civilization in the East and the gold-filled fantasies of California. But the Lakota? They were the plains. They didn't build walled cities or carve kingdoms into stone. Their empire was the wind, the river, the rhythm of bison herds stretching from the Missouri to the Rockies. They were nomads, yes, but don't confuse that with disorder. The Lakota way of life was an intricate tapestry of family, ceremony, politics, and war. Their territory wasn't just land, it was memory-made geography. And then along came the Americans, drunk on railroad, money, and divine right. Now, let's back up a little. The Lakota weren't always on the plains. Originally, they were forest people from the woodlands of the Great Lakes region, but through migration, conflict, and an almost supernatural knack for survival, they pushed westward. By the 18th century, they had acquired horses, courtesy of the Spanish, and oh, did they weaponize that gift. Horses turned the Lakota into a cavalry before cavalry knew what hit them. They moved faster, hunted better, fought harder, and within a few decades they had become the dominant power in the northern plains, outmaneuvering enemy tribes, outlasting disease, and outsmarting colonial powers. The Americans didn't know what they were in for. You'd think the U.S. government, after all the violent headaches it had already endured from the Shawnee, the Creek, the Seminoles, and basically every nation it had tried to stomp, would have learned. But no, the arrogance was baked in. At first, the U.S. tried the old peace and friendship approach, aka sign a treaty, promise the stars, and then send in surveyors and soldiers anyway. The 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty drew a massive map, declaring a huge swath of the Great Plains as Lakota territory. It was a great piece of paper. The only problem? Gold was discovered in Colorado, and suddenly all that sacred land started looking suspiciously negotiable. Soon, American settlers poured into Lakota lands like ants over a picnic, dragging with them smallpox, whiskey, and entitlement. And as always, conflict followed. The Lakota, for their part, had been preparing. These weren't bands of wandering hunters. They were united. 7 sub-tribes, collectively known as the Ochethi-Shakoving, had formed a confederacy so well organized it would have made a Roman senator blush. Leaders like Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and later Sitting Bull weren't just warriors. They were strategists, prophets, diplomats. Red Cloud, for example, is one of the only native leaders to win a war against the United States. His campaign from 1866 to 1868, known appropriately as Red Cloud's War, wasn't just a series of ambushes and skirmishes. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, terrain control, and sheer audacity. When the U.S. tried to build a trail through Lakota hunting grounds, known as the Bozeman Trail, Red Cloud didn't send a polite letter of complaint. He laid siege to the forts along the route: Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith, Fort Reno, under constant attack. Supply lines cut, morale shattered, and then came the Fetterman Massacre. 80 men, led by a captain who reportedly said, "Give me 80 men and I can ride through the whole Sioux Nation," were lured into a trap and annihilated. None survived. The Lakota left their bodies stripped and dismembered. It was brutal, it was theatrical, and it worked. The U.S. blinked. In 1868, the Second Fort Laramie Treaty was signed, giving the Lakota the Black Hills, a sacred, mountainous Eden in perpetuity, which in American means, until we change our minds. Because in 1874, gold was discovered in those same Black Hills. Cue déjà vu. Now, imagine a scenario where you're given a house, and someone comes knocking, saying, "Hey, I know we gave you this house, but we just found a diamond in the basement, so we're taking it back." That's exactly what happened. The U.S. government offered to buy the Black Hills. The Lakota refused, so Washington decided to take them by force, and thus began the Great Sioux War of 1876. Now, we must pause for dramatic irony, because this is where General George Armstrong Custer gallops into our story, with his shiny golden locks and utter lack of humility. Custer, a Civil War hero turned Indian fighter, believed he could stomp the Lakota and their allies in one clean blow. Instead, he rode into the Little Bighorn and straight into one of the most humiliating defeats in American military history. Led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors descended on Custer's 7th Cavalry. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Within an hour, over 260 American soldiers lay dead, their bodies scattered like broken toys across the bluffs. The news stunned the nation. The myth of manifest destiny cracked. But here's the tragedy. Victory often breeds vengeance. After Little Bighorn, the U.S. government ramped up its military campaign. The goal was no longer to negotiate. It was to annihilate. General Crook, General Miles, and others launched winter offensives, targeting Lakota camps when families were most vulnerable. Starvation replaced the bullet as the preferred weapon, and the Lakota, despite their resilience, were slowly crushed beneath the weight of this industrial war machine. By 1877, Crazy Horse had surrendered. He was stabbed to death under a white flag because apparently even surrender wasn't safe. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Red Cloud was isolated. The unity of the Oceti-Shakopee began to fracture. By the 1880s, most Lakota had been forced onto reservations. Their children were sent to boarding schools where their hair was cut, their language forbidden, their names replaced, their horses were slaughtered, their sacred ceremonies outlawed, their lives reduced to ration cards and humiliation. But here's the twist. Despite every betrayal, every broken treaty, every attempt to erase them, the Lakota did not disappear. They endured. Their stories carried forward like wind through the grass. Their songs still echo in ceremonies held in the dark, in secret, whispered from elder to child. And though the U.S. thought it had broken them, what it had done instead was prove just how unbreakable they truly were. Stick around, because in part 2 we'll dive into the ghost dance, the prophecy that shook the American military to its core, and the massacre that proved just how terrified the empire was of a nation that refused to die. Let's pick up where we left off, with the Lakota confined to reservations, their land seized, their traditions under siege, and their future a smoldering question mark. The government thought the story was over, that the Lakota were now just a footnote in a textbook. But history, as usual, doesn't follow a script. It haunts the stage. By the late 1880s, the Lakota, along with other tribes across the West, were spiritually starving. Their buffalo were gone, hunted to near extinction by settlers and soldiers alike. Their sovereignty was in tatters. Their children were being punished in government schools for speaking their own language. Their warriors were disarmed, dismounted, and dishonored. The American dream was a nightmare, and the dreamers were gasping for air. And then something stirred in Nevada. No, not gold this time, not railroads, something far stranger, a vision. A Paiute prophet named Wovoka, who had experienced a powerful trance during a solar eclipse, began preaching that the native peoples could restore their world through a sacred dance. A circle dance, a movement of unity, rebirth, and non-violence. He said the old world would return, the buffalo would rise, the dead would walk, the white man's bullets would be powerless. It sounded too good to be true, and yet, across the plains, the ghost dance spread like fire through dry grass. To the Lakota, this was more than hope. It was resurrection. Picture the reservations in 1890, skeletal horses, government agents, dry wells, and silence. Then suddenly, the ground shaking with drums, people spinning in circles for hours, chanting, weeping, singing of ancestors and buffalo. The ghost dance was a last breath of cultural defiance, disguised as religion, a revolution in rhythm. But to the U.S. government, it looked like war. The thing about colonial powers is they panic when the people they've crushed start smiling again. When Lakota began sewing ghost shirts, believing they could repel bullets, the military didn't see prophecy. They saw insurrection. They saw Sitting Bull, who by now had returned from exile in Canada, as the ringleader, even though he was more symbolic than strategic at this point. And so, in December 1890, they came for him. A group of Indian police, native men ordered by the U.S., to arrest one of their greatest spiritual leaders, surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin. The result? Confusion, panic, and gunfire. Sitting Bull was shot in the head. A warrior turned ghost, just as the prophecy foretold, but not the way anyone had hoped. His death sent shockwaves across the reservation. Many of his followers fled south to join Chief Bigfoot, a mini Kanju Lakota leader who was desperately trying to lead his people to safety at Pine Ridge, but they were intercepted. On December 28, 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry, the same regiment Custer had led to his glorious doom, caught up with Bigfoot's band near a creek called Wounded Knee. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. The soldiers set up Hotchkiss guns, early machine guns, glorified meat grinders, and surrounded the Lakota camp. Bigfoot, who was ill with pneumonia and carrying a white flag, told his people not to resist. They were surrendering. But paranoia has a trigger finger. When a deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote refused to hand over his rifle, out of fear or defiance, no one knows, a shot rang out. Chaos erupted, and the soldiers opened fire. Within minutes, bodies were everywhere. Women clutching infants, children crawling through snowdrifts only to be gunned down. The Hotchkiss guns mowed them down like stalks of corn. Roughly 300 Lakota died that day. Most were unarmed. Many were shot in the back as they fled. The snow turned red, and the wind howled through the silence like it was morning. The government called it a regrettable incident. Then they gave 20 medals of honor to the men who committed it. Pause on that. 20 medals of honor for shooting women and children. And yet, the Lakota didn't vanish. Again. In the aftermath of Wounded Knee, the ghost dance faded. The drums fell silent. The survivors mourned, but they didn't forget. They buried their dead, and with them, buried the illusion that the U.S. would ever honor its word. The dream had changed. Now it was about endurance. Fast forward. The 20th century rolled in with its jazz, its world wars, its highways cutting through old hunting trails. The Lakota were still there, marginalized, impoverished, but breathing. During World War I and II, many Lakota men volunteered to fight. Not for the U.S. flag, but for honor, for the warrior tradition. Irony dripped from every uniform stitched on the reservation. Then came the 1970s. If you thought the story had ended, think again. A new generation rose, angry, educated, electrified by civil rights movements. The American Indian Movement, AIM, began staging occupations and protests, demanding justice, visibility, sovereignty, and in 1973, they returned to Wounded Knee, this time with guns. AIM seized the town in a 71-day standoff with federal agents. Helicopters circled, FBI snipers lurked in the grass. But the message was clear. We remember. This land remembers. It wasn't just a protest, it was an exorcism. The wounds of 1890 still bled in 1973, and they still bleed now, in poverty rates, in health disparities, in the scars of children taught to forget their own language. But here's what makes the Lakota unbreakable. They keep singing, at powwows, at protests, at funerals, at sunrise. Their stories live in oral tradition, in sweat lodges, in the soft hush of sage smoke rising into the stars. The U.S. couldn't break them, not with treaties, not with bullets, not with boarding schools or starvation. Because how do you destroy people who are built from story? How do you silence a nation that speaks to its ancestors through the wind? How do you end a people who learned long ago that endurance is its own form of revolution? Stick around for part 3, where we'll explore the spiritual worldview of the Lakota, their cosmology, their vision quests, and why their understanding of time and life might just make more sense than anything the modern world has to offer. Forget what you know about time, burn your calendars, toss your wristwatch into a canyon. Because in the world of the Lakota, time doesn't march forward. It doesn't tick like a metronome counting down to lunch. It circles, it spirals, it returns. The Lakota don't just live in history, they cycle through it. To understand why the US government could never fully break the Lakota, you have to stop thinking like an empire and start thinking like a drumbeat. Because for the Lakota, reality isn't about domination, it's about balance. And that's the very thing settlers, drunk on railroads, rifles, and manifest destiny, could never grasp. At the center of Lakota life is Wakan Tanka, a term often mistranslated as Great Spirit, but that's like calling Beethoven just a guy who liked piano. Wakan Tanka is not a singular god, it's a sacred mystery, a force, a presence in all things, stone, water, wind, buffalo, breath. It's everything and nothing, power and humility. The joke is, even the word Wakan means sacred and mysterious. So good luck pinning it down with Western theology. And through this sacred lens, everything in the Lakota universe is interconnected. Humans aren't above animals. Mountains aren't background scenery. Trees are relatives. Stars are ancestors. The land isn't owned, it's respected. That's why treaties were more than contracts. Breaking them wasn't just dishonest, it was sacrilege. Now let's talk about vision quests, Hanblacheya. This wasn't some adolescent camping trip where you bring peyote and find yourself in the desert. This was raw spiritual surgery. A young Lakota seeking direction in life would head into the wilderness, alone with no food or water, and cry for a vision. That's not a metaphor. That's the term. Crying for a vision. You sit, you pray, you call out to the spirits, and if you're lucky or cursed, something answers. The visions weren't always comforting. They were often cryptic, violent, or humbling, but they guided the soul. They anchored identity. You didn't just find your path. You found how your path intertwined with everything else. The animals, the winds, the dead, the unborn. Can you imagine what would happen if a Wall Street intern had to go 4 days without Wi-Fi and avocado toast to determine their purpose? Exactly. The Lakota were raised with an existential toughness modern life can't simulate. Their survival wasn't about brute strength, it was about harmony, knowing when to fight and when to fast, when to hunt, and when to thank the deer for giving its life. That kind of ethic is hard to conquer because it doesn't rely on power, it relies on humility. Let's talk about death. To the Lakota, death isn't the end, it's a transformation. When a person dies, they don't vanish, they change form. Their spirit walks the Milky Way, a path of stars known as the Spirit Road. If they lived well, with courage and generosity, they joined the ancestors. If they didn't, well, maybe they return as a whisper in the wind, or a shadow beneath the clouds, watching, learning, waiting. It makes the modern obsession with legacy and status feel a little empty, doesn't it? Because in Lakota thought, you're not remembered for your LinkedIn profile. You're remembered for your kindness, your bravery, your ability to bring balance to your people. You live in stories, not spreadsheets. And speaking of stories, everything is oral. Western civilization wrote its power into books and treaties and manifestos. The Lakota whispered theirs around fires, they sang it into drums, they danced it into the dust. And stories do something incredible. They move, a book can burn, a file can be deleted, but a story told to a child becomes a part of them. It outlives borders, it migrates like birds, it can't be fenced in, and that's the secret. The U.S. government tried everything, forced relocations, broken treaties, boarding schools where children were beaten for speaking Lakota. They cut hair, replaced names, banned ceremonies. They tried to silence the drum, but the stories kept circling. And circles are stubborn things. Unlike straight lines, they don't lead to conquest. They return, again and again, like the seasons, like grief, like resistance. Even the Lakota teepee, yes, the stereotyped cone-shaped tent, embodied this worldview. It's a circle on the ground, it faces the rising sun. Its construction is a ritual. It's not just a shelter, it's a prayer you sleep inside. Compare that to the square, boxy forts of the US Army. Squares to control, circles to belong. Which brings us to perhaps the most ironic twist of all. The very traits the US mocked, oral culture, spiritual beliefs, tribal governance, are now being studied, admired, and even envied by people disillusioned with modern life. Eco-activists quote indigenous land ethics. Therapists borrow native healing methods. Academics reference Lakota cosmology when trying to explain quantum entanglement or systems theory. The people who were nearly erased are now showing the rest of the world how to live. But don't mistake that for a Hollywood redemption arc. The pain didn't vanish. Pine Ridge Reservation, home to many Lakota, remains one of the poorest places in the U.S. unemployment. Alcoholism, suicide, the shadows of Wounded Knee are long, and yet, hope smolders like sage in ceremony. Young Lakota are reclaiming their language, reviving ceremonies, riding horses across old trails like ghost warriors, singing old songs into cell phones, using TikTok to tell stories the cavalry couldn't erase. Because the circle isn't just a symbol, it's a strategy. Empires crumble in straight lines, expansion, peak, decline, fall. The Lakota survive in circles and the drum still beats. In Part 4, we'll return to the battlefield, not just the physical ones, but the cultural ones. We'll look at Lakota resistance in the modern era, from courtrooms to oil pipelines. Because this story didn't end at Wounded Knee, it's still being written, and guess who's holding the pen now? History has a tendency to declare things over. The last battle, the final treaty, the closing of the frontier. The textbook says, and then the Indians were defeated, like a period slapped on the end of a very bloody sentence. But the Lakota never got that memo, because what happened after Wounded Knee in 1890 wasn't the end of their resistance. It was the beginning of a much quieter war, one fought not with rifles, but with memory, ceremony, and sheer spiritual refusal to vanish. Let's rewind to December 29th, 1890, a frozen dawn, Wounded Knee Creek. After a rising paranoia over the ghost dance, a spiritual movement sweeping through native communities that terrified U.S. officials more than any rifle ever could, the 7th Cavalry intercepted a band of Lakota, mostly women and children. Tensions crackled. A single gunshot was fired. What followed was a massacre. Over 250 Lakota were killed. Many were unarmed. Some were infants. The soldiers were later awarded medals of honor. Yes, medals. The U.S. thought that would close the book. But stories don't end with slaughter. They haunt. They ripple. Wounded Knee didn't erase the Lakota. It embalmed their resolve. It turned the massacre into a mythic wound. Open, unhealed, sacred. And from that wound came fire. The 20th century arrived with steel teeth. Boarding schools that tried to beat the Lakota language out of children. Kill the Indian, save the man policies, and relentless poverty engineered by reservation systems. And yet, the Lakota didn't assimilate. They adapted. Imagine raising a family in a shack with no electricity while still conducting sacred ceremonies outlawed by the US government. Imagine translating your grandmother's wisdom into English just to preserve it from extinction. Imagine using Catholic boarding school English to write back in Lakota thought. That's not defeat. That's tactical cultural espionage. Fast forward to 1973, Wounded Knee again. This time, the American Indian Movement, AIM, including many Lakota, occupied the site of the massacre for 71 days. Armed standoff, FBI agents, national headlines, the ghosts of 1890 rising from the snow. The U.S. was stunned. They had assumed native resistance had gone the way of the buffalo. They didn't realize the buffalo were also coming back. The 1973 occupation didn't just bring attention, it lit a cultural revival. Young Lakota began asking their elders about the old ways. Language classes formed, ceremonies resurfaced, drums got louder, and the circle turned again. Because remember, Lakota resistance isn't about one explosive rebellion. It's intergenerational insubordination. It's subtle, it's ceremonial. It's surviving in a system designed to erase you and somehow coming out with your laughter intact. Which brings us to Standing Rock, North Dakota. A proposed pipeline, Dakota Access, was set to tunnel beneath the Missouri River, threatening the water supply of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. The authorities called it a development project. The Lakota called it what it was. Another broken promise. So they gathered, they prayed, and they refused to move. At first, the world yawned, another protest in the middle of nowhere. But then came the images. Lakota grandmothers standing in front of riot police. Drones capturing the clash of two nations, one with tear gas, the other with eagle feathers. The water protectors weren't just resisting a pipeline. They were defending an entire worldview, one that sees water as sacred, one that doesn't divide environment from spirit, one that still listens to the land when it speaks. And the world noticed. People came from all over, Navajo, Maori, Sami, Black Lives Matter activists, Buddhist monks, even US veterans. They stood in the cold, shared meals, sang songs older than America. For a brief moment, the circle widened. The pipeline was completed anyway, because, well, history doesn't always give us neat victories. But here's the trick. Lakota resistance isn't measured in court cases won. It's measured in stories carried, songs remembered, children born into their language. And the stories of Standing Rock are still being told, across classrooms, across oceans, across generations. Today, the Lakota remain legally sovereign on paper and brutally colonized in practice. Many live in third world conditions, but they also live with a clarity the modern world lacks. a knowing that life is not about domination, but relation, not about extraction, but reciprocity. And while the US continues to grapple with the existential panic of climate collapse and inequality and meaninglessness, the Lakota have been holding the answers quietly all along. They never left the land. They just waited for the world to remember it was alive. So what does it mean that the US couldn't break them? It means every failed treaty, every massacre, every effort to erase the Lakota ended up feeding the very mythology that keeps them strong. It means you can kill a man, but not the story that made him. It means they outlived the frontier, outlasted the empire, and now stand at the edge of a new era, not as relics, but as guides. Because here's the irony to end on. The same government that tried to silence the Lakota now has to listen to them if it wants to survive the 21st century. Turns out, the wisdom of people who lived in harmony with the land might just be what saves us from ourselves. The circle turns, and the Lakota are still here. Hey guys, did you know that one of the most effective secret weapons of World War II wasn't a tank, wasn't a bomb, and wasn't a cipher machine? It was a language older than the United States itself, a language the government once tried to erase and then desperately needed to survive. Welcome to the story where irony gets a starring role. History forgets who the villain is, and native boys save the world with a mother tongue once banned in their own schools. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Imagine this. You grow up herding sheep in the red dust of Diné Bikea, the sacred Navajo homeland, where cliffs blush at sunset and silence is a kind of music. Your grandmother tells you stories in a tongue with no past or future tense, only motion. You don't learn to write it, you barely learn to read English, and yet somehow your voice is destined to carry entire war fronts across oceans. But let's rewind. Before they were code talkers, they were the problem. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the US government's official approach to Native identity was, make it go away. Boarding schools, reservation policies, language bans. You were beaten for speaking Navajo, your braids were cut, your name was changed, because obviously the best way to civilize someone is to convince them they're broken. Children were pulled from their families and taught how to scrub the Indian off their souls. Some survived, some didn't, but all were changed. And yet, the language survived. It survived whispered in kitchens, sung in ceremony, hummed under breath like a form of resistance. The Navajo tongue, full of glottal stops and desert rhythms, refused to be broken. Fast forward to the early 1940s. America is at war with a few very motivated fascists. The Japanese are intercepting US messages faster than teenage boys intercept trouble on a Saturday night. Every code gets cracked, every cipher gets compromised, military brass are pulling their hair out. And then, like all truly American ideas, someone suggests something both brilliant and vaguely exploitative. What if we used a language they'll never crack? Enter Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran and the son of missionaries who'd grown up on the Navajo Nation. He remembered that Navajo was so complex, so regionally specific, and so unwritten that it might as well be alien to the outside world. No alphabet, no textbook, and spoken fluently by fewer than 30 non-Navajos on Earth. It wasn't just hard to learn, it was impossible to even start learning without a Navajo speaker willing to walk you through it, syllable by ancient syllable. Perfect. The military drooled. In 1942, the Marines recruited 29 Navajo men, boys, really. Not because they were trusted, not because they were treated as equals, but because their grandmothers had stubbornly refused to stop talking. Imagine the absurdity. The same government that beat your uncle for speaking Navajo in 1920 now begs you to save their war in 1942 by doing the exact same thing, and not just speak it, but turn it into an uncrackable military code. The men said yes. Of course they did, because this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was reclamation. It was pride. It was a way of saying, you tried to bury us with shame. Now you need our words to win your war. Let's talk about how hard that actually was. First, there is no word in Navajo for tank, or grenade, or machine gun. So the code talkers got creative. A tank? Che de guy, literally turtle. Because what is a tank if not a very aggressive turtle? A bomber? J-show, buzzard. Submarine? Besh-low, iron fish. You want to say destroyer ship in code? You don't spell it out phonetically, you say ka-lo-sai, shark. These weren't just translations, they were poetic encryption, beautifully absurd and deadly effective, and it worked. During battles in the Pacific, Navajo code talkers transmitted messages faster than any machine. In Iwo Jima, over 800 messages were sent in the first 48 hours. 0 errors. Japanese cryptographers listened in and had no idea they were hearing a real language. They thought it was gibberish, which frankly is what you get when you try to eavesdrop on a language with no formal writing system and 90 unique sounds. But this wasn't just clever code, this was trench-deep courage, because these men weren't on safe bases in California. They were in foxholes, under fire, crawling through the jungle with radios the size of washing machines strapped to their backs. They ran wires through bullet storms. They dodged friendly fire, because some US soldiers thought they were Japanese. Yeah, racism doesn't stop just because you're bleeding on the same beach. And all the while, they kept speaking. They spoke in the tongue of creation stories and corn pollen prayers. They sent coordinates for artillery strikes in a language forged for harmony. They talked death using words meant for life, and yet they were not recognized. For decades after the war, the code talker's role remained classified. No medals, no parades, no chapters in the history books, just a handshake and a "thanks, boys," before they were dropped back onto reservations riddled with poverty, unemployment, and broken promises. The code was too valuable to reveal, even if it meant the people who created it stayed invisible. Meanwhile, white generals got statues, presidents got libraries, the code talkers got back to work. Some became janitors, some became carpenters. Some returned to the fields, herding sheep under the same wide sky, probably thinking, well, at least I got to beat the Axis powers in my grandma's voice. Because they weren't in it for glory. They were in it for each other, for their families, for a homeland that never stopped aching beneath their feet. And yet, something shifted over time. In the 1980s, the truth started to surface. The Navajo code was finally declassified. Documentaries aired, medals were awarded. Not enough, of course, but more than silence. The world began to realize that these weren't just war heroes. They were living proof that cultural survival is the most strategic resistance of all. Because what saved the Marines in World War II wasn't just tactical brilliance. It was the result of an entire people refusing to forget who they were. And here's the kicker. The code was never broken, not once, not by the Japanese, not by the Germans, not by time. So next time you hear someone joke about how hard Navajo is, remember, it literally saved the free world, and it was spoken by men who weren't even considered full citizens of the country they were saving. History, you've got a funny way of picking your heroes, usually after they've died, preferably after you've ignored them. But this time, some of them lived long enough to tell their stories, in their own language, with a smile that says, "We never left. You just finally started listening. You've heard the legend. Now, let's go deeper, into the dust, the spit, the bureaucracy, and the bleak hilarity of what it meant to be a Navajo code talker in a war that barely remembered your name. Picture this. You're 17, maybe 18. You've never seen the ocean. You've probably never left Arizona or New Mexico. And now, you're on a boat to the Pacific, stuffed in a tin can with 300 other men, trying not to throw up your last bite of government-issued beans while you memorize new codes built from your ancestral language. Because surprise, being a code talker wasn't just about knowing Navajo. It was about bending Navajo into something militarily functional, which is like taking Shakespeare and using it to order a cheeseburger, only backwards and under fire. Let's talk about the code system. At first it was small, just 29 men creating a code with around 200 words. But war evolves faster than flu season, so soon they needed over 600 coded terms. You want to say battleship? That's lotso or whale. How about commanding officer? Try hashke ginata, meaning war chief. Airplane? That's to dine-i, the people of the air. But here's the beautiful catch. For letters not covered by word substitution, they use Navajo words starting with specific letters. To spell F, for example, you'd say the Navajo word for fox, ma'i, except Navajo doesn't have an alphabet or traditional spelling. So they just made one, like linguist magicians, or slightly exhausted teenagers with a deadline and a war to win. Still sounds simple. Good. Because now you're going to memorize all 600 plus terms with zero written materials. No cheat sheets, nothing on paper. Why? Because if you get captured and they find it on you, the code's blown. So everything had to live in your head. And not just your own messages, you had to decode incoming ones too, live on the spot, with shells raining around you and commanders shouting over the roar of machine gun fire. Picture being on Iwo Jima. It's February 1945, black sand, sulfur vents, Japanese snipers in tunnels under your feet. You've been awake for 36 hours. Your radio weighs 60 pounds. You're transmitting troop movements, requesting artillery support, dodging bullets, translating in real time. And you're still not allowed to be an officer. You can save the operation, but you can't lead it. That part's reserved for the real Americans. Welcome to military absurdity. The Marines, to their credit, started calling the code talkers indispensable. One major said the US would never have taken Iwo Jima without them. But back home, newspapers just called it an Allied victory. No mention of the language that made it happen. No mention of the men whispering into their radios like ghosts with a cause. And speaking of home, let's go back to where these boys came from. Life on the Navajo reservation was a complex cocktail of spiritual tradition, systemic neglect, and environmental hardship. We're talking arid lands, minimal infrastructure, few roads, almost no modern conveniences. Electricity, not common. Running water, rare. Schooling, patchy at best. And that was before the government decided your livestock were destroying the land and started slaughtering your sheep en masse in the 1930s. Yes, that happened. It was called the Navajo Livestock Reduction Program, and it's exactly as grim as it sounds. Officials ordered Navajo families to kill their own sheep and goats, lifelines for food, clothing, trade, because apparently the answer to poor soil management was to gut the economy of the people least responsible. So these young men, born into a community already recovering from trauma, already battered by broken treaties and economic sabotage, they are the ones who end up saving America. They enlist, they serve, they bleed, they survive. And when they come home, no parade, no GI Bill access. That's right, Native Americans didn't gain full US citizenship until 1924. And even after that, benefits were distributed unevenly, if at all. Some got help, most didn't. But the worst part? They still couldn't talk about it. The Code Talker program remained classified until 1968. That's 23 years of silence, 2 decades where these men worked gas stations, farmed fields, swept floors, and no one knew they were national treasures. Imagine being a janitor in Gallup, New Mexico, while your coworkers complain about taxes, and all you can do is nod, because the thing you did for your country is still top secret. That's not just injustice, that's absurdist tragedy. But that was the price of security, of anonymity, of fighting a war with your voice, then going back to a country that still didn't know how to hear you. Even the recognition that eventually came was awkward at best. In the early 80s, a few of the original 29 got honored at the Pentagon. They wore suits. The room clapped. Someone gave a speech about bravery and honor. It was touching. It was too late. Because the men weren't looking for statues. They were looking for jobs, for clean water on the reservation, for language programs in schools that still treated Navajo as an extracurricular oddity. To this day, the legacy of the Code Talkers remains double-edged. On one hand, legends. On the other, lessons unlearned. But let's not forget, these weren't superheroes. These were teenage boys from a nation within a nation, asked to risk everything for a country that treated them like a footnote. They said yes anyway. They said yes because survival wasn't new to them. Resistance wasn't new to them. Being underestimated was just Tuesday. And what they did with words. Not bullets. Not bombs. They weaponized the very thing the government had once tried to erase. Their language, their culture, their stories. So next time someone tells you history is boring, tell them about the Iron Fish. About the buzzards and turtles and sharks who won the war. About a code that outlived generals and outwitted machines. About boys who became silent legends, not because they wanted to, but because the world needed them to be quiet. Under the blistering sun and bureaucratic fog of post-war America, the Navajo Code Talkers returned. not as heroes with medals, but as shadows melting back into the very land they'd grown up on. Their names weren't in the papers. Their stories weren't taught in schools. They had been the voice of victory, and now they were voiceless again. Let's begin this third chapter with a simple, soul-punching fact. While America marveled at its victory over fascism, many code talkers were returning to homes without electricity, without running water, without even the dignity of a paved road. The same government they had served in war had offered them little more than a boot print in peacetime. And if that doesn't feel like historical whiplash, I don't know what does. But these men, raised on resilience and silence, did what they had always done: endure. They raised families, they herded sheep. Some became carpenters, farmers, janitors, gas station clerks. A few got into tribal politics, and some, weary of waiting for recognition, just faded into the land like echoes in the canyon. The irony? While their work had helped turn the tide of World War II, their own children often never knew what they'd done. Many Navajo men who had served didn't talk about it, not out of shame, but because they were literally not allowed to. The program was still classified, and when it finally was declassified in 1968, no one rushed to throw a parade. Let's talk about that recognition, or lack thereof. For years, the only people who truly understood what the code talkers had done were fellow Marines. In battle, they had relied on those Navajo voices, knowing that without them, chaos would reign. It's said that during Iwo Jima, 6 code talkers sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. 800 messages under fire, under sleep deprivation, under the weight of every mistake being potentially fatal. And yet, when they came home, no housing assistance, no access to full veteran benefits, no formal apology. It's as if the U.S. government had filed them back under miscellaneous. Meanwhile, Cold War America surged ahead. Television, suburbia, rocket launches, fast food, while life on the Navajo Nation remained unforgiving. Decades of broken treaties, poisoned water, and land seizures had already made sure that equality was a theory, not a reality. And here's where the absurdity sharpens its teeth. These were men who had developed one of the only unbroken codes in modern military history. Their language had outwitted every Axis cryptographer. Japan's most brilliant minds couldn't crack it. But back home, schools were still trying to beat that same language out of native children. Yes, that happened. All across America, native children, including young Navajo, were sent to boarding schools where speaking their own language could get them punished, slapped, locked in closets, forced to write lines for hours like some Orwellian fever dream. I will not speak Navajo, I will speak English only. So imagine the cognitive dissonance. Your grandfather used Navajo to win a world war, but you're getting detention for speaking it in the lunchroom. Welcome to the cruel circus of historical irony. But let's pause here, because despite the silence, something extraordinary began to happen. In the 1980s and 90s, veterans and historians started digging. Families spoke up. Survivors began to whisper their truths, then speak them louder. Slowly, the veil lifted. In 2001, decades after the last shot was fired, President George W. Bush awarded the original 29 Navajo code talkers the Congressional Gold Medal. Silver medals were given to the hundreds of others who followed in their footsteps. A ceremony was held, speeches were given. Honor finally arrived, but as always, late. Many of the men had already passed on. Those who remained stood quiet in suits that didn't quite fit, medals hanging over hearts that had carried the weight of silence for too long. And even then, even in the glow of recognition, some of them remained humorously grounded. When asked about the medals, one code talker is reported to have shrugged and said, "Nice medal, but I'd rather have plumbing." Tell me that's not the most pointed summary of Native American policy in U.S. history. Recognition is powerful, but running water is useful. Yet even that dry punchline belies something deeper, a love of home, a loyalty that never asked for attention. The code talkers didn't serve for glory. They served because they believed, despite all the betrayal and absurdity, that America could be something better. Not was, but could be. Let's zoom in for a moment on one particular battlefield, Saipan. The fighting there was ferocious, brutal, and full of moral nightmares. But code talkers worked around the clock, relaying coordinates, calling in airstrikes, saving lives. At one point, when communications between units were completely severed, It was a Navajo transmission that restored order. Imagine that. A battlefield drowning in blood, and the lifeline is a whisper in a language once called primitive, by the very men now depending on it. This wasn't just history. This was irony with combat boots on. By the end of the war, over 400 Navajo men had served as code talkers. They never lost a message. Their code was never broken. And yet, they came home to find their language still dismissed as non-essential. Their culture treated like a costume for Thanksgiving pageants, and their contributions stuffed into the dusty drawer of forgotten files. And let's not sugarcoat this. There were consequences, psychological ones. Imagine surviving Iwo Jima only to face poverty, racism, and spiritual alienation in your own homeland. The term PTSD didn't exist yet. Therapy question, mark, not a thing on the res. You dealt with your trauma by working, or drinking, or going quiet. And still, the stories came. One code talker, Chester Nez, would later write a memoir detailing how they developed the code, how they trained under pressure, how they fought, and how they were told to forget it all. Another, Peter MacDonald, became a powerful advocate, pushing for veterans' rights, education, and recognition, not just for code talkers, but for all Native Americans who served. Because here's the dark twist. Native Americans serve in the U.S. military at higher rates per capita than any other ethnic group. They have for over a century. Why? Because defending the land is in the bones. Even if the government doesn't deserve that loyalty, the land still does. And maybe that's what the code talkers understood better than anyone. That patriotism isn't obedience, it's hope. Hope that the country you serve might one day become worthy of the service. Their story is not just about war, it's about irony, about survival, about carrying a sacred ancient language into a mechanized hell and letting it sing. They didn't fight with rifles, they fought with memory, with syntax, with metaphor. They were the last poets of a dying world, slipping meaning between bullets, and somehow, impossibly, they won. Let's end this story the way it must be ended. Not with a clean moral, not with fireworks, not with America patting itself on the back, but with a quiet walk through memory, language, and land. Because what the Navajo code talkers left behind wasn't just a military legacy, it was a paradox, a triumph buried in silence, a victory that still feels like an open wound. By the early 2000s, most of the original code talkers were old men, wrinkled hands, weathered eyes, voices that had once been lightning over the Pacific now whispered through oxygen tubes. Some lived in trailers, others on land passed down through generations. Land that had seen both cavalry raids and satellite dishes. People came to interview them, documentarians, military historians, journalists who suddenly realized they'd missed something seismic. Some code talkers were willing to speak, others weren't. For many, the war had never really ended. It just moved inward, into dreams, into silence, into the heavy quiet that follows after you've carried a secret for half a century. The irony was relentless. There were commemorative stamps, street names, a Hollywood movie that got the uniforms right and the dignity wrong. Medals, finally, shined up and handed out in Washington, D.C., a place most of them had never been to before and probably never wanted to see again. Some people clapped, others cried, and still, on the reservation, the tap water remained undrinkable. Let's talk about that for a moment, because this isn't just a war story. This is a story about the way a nation uses people like batteries, drains them, praises them, and then discards them in the drawer, labeled heritage. By 2020, only a handful of code talkers were still alive. Some had become speakers, sharing their experiences with schools, veterans groups, anyone who would listen. Others stayed quiet, not because they were bitter, but because they had already given more than enough. One such man, Joe Van Dever Sr., passed away at 96. He was known for his long braids, his steady voice, and his refusal to be simplified into a soundbite. His death, like so many others, came with a familiar headline: "Another Navajo code talker has died," as if they were the last leaves falling from a tree that had once hidden an entire army. But here's the thing, they weren't relics. They were revolutionaries, language revolutionaries, survivors of cultural genocide who turned their survival into the most elegant military code in modern history. And even now, the echoes of that code still ripple. In Navajo classrooms, there's a quiet resurgence. Teachers are fighting to preserve the language. Young Navajo students are learning to say turtle and tank and America in the same tongue their great-grandfathers used to outwit the Japanese military. It's not easy. Decades of forced assimilation did their work. Some kids grow up without a single fluent speaker in their home. Some don't even know that their language was once a weapon, a secret weapon, the kind that doesn't explode but liberates. And maybe that's the most painful part of all. The very thing that saved thousands of American lives is now listed by UNESCO as a language at risk of extinction. That should be unthinkable. That should be a national crisis. But in the American way of doing things, crisis only matters when it makes someone money. And yet, the resistance continues, in homes, around kitchen tables, in ceremonies that the government never understood. Elders still tell stories. Mothers hum songs. Children learn the word for victory and for loss, and understand that in Navajo, the two are sometimes the same. So what's left? Not just medals, not just textbooks or documentaries or flag-draped funerals. What's left is the idea that language is survival, that memory matters, that the past is not something we escape. It's something we carry, woven into us like threads in a blanket. The code talkers carried their past into battle, and they carried their people's dignity with them. Even when that dignity had been spat on, legislated against, mocked in classrooms, and stolen by bureaucrats in suits who called it progress, they proved, with every syllable, that survival is not just endurance, it is resistance. It is a form of poetry, a way of saying we are still here, even when everything around you insists you shouldn't be. In the end, there is no statue tall enough to honor what they did, because what they did wasn't just military, it was spiritual, it was linguistic, it was cultural defiance wrapped in code, wrapped in courage, wrapped in a whisper that no one could decode unless they understood the world it came from. The enemy never cracked it, America barely understood it, but the land did, and the land remembers, the canyons, the mesas, the dry riverbeds. They still echo with those words, not because they were tactical, but because they were sacred. Every message sent in that war carried more than coordinates. It carried a people's survival, and that's the lesson, the pain, and the power of the code talkers. They didn't just fight for victory, they fought for voice. And against all odds, against erasure, assimilation, silence, they won.